when they entered the wilderness of the Red Sea. They camped before Pi-hahiroth, which means the mouth of the channel. Not the top of the channel, the mouth of the channel. They were camped before that. We are told that they are located between Migdol and the sea. Migdol is not a city. Migdol is a Hebrew word that refers to either a tower, a fortress, or even high mountains. You need to appreciate the fact that these people had been living all their life in the Nile Delta. All they knew was land that was flat. They were now traveling in a region of the Sinai Peninsula or away from their homeland, and they were surrounded on one side by the sea and on the other side by some very, very steep mountains. The fourth fact is that we are told that they camped opposite Baal-zephon. Baal-zephon means literally God of the North. It's a pagan reference, but it's also a reference to the God of the unknown. And oftentimes ancient seafarers would speak of islands that would be along their way, that would be the last island that they would encounter before they would go into the Sea of Unknown. And of course, the Red Sea was a daunting journey for those who would venture out into it. And so, as we keep that in mind, we look at the places that some Bible scholars and historians and archaeologists have placed the crossing of the Red Sea. Some, of course, hold to this idea of the Reed Sea, that there was a marshy area that the children of Israel crossed over. There is those who believe the Red Sea refers to the northern portion of the Suez. But there is some latest discoveries in the last 25 years that are very provocative. One is on the eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula at a place called Nuweiba. And the last is at the Straits of Tiran. The very southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula also has some very interesting evidence, remembering that evidence on the Sinai Peninsula itself with its monastery at what's called Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, of course, has none of the items that are specifically referenced in Scripture. So when we look at these locations, the Reed Sea, it just doesn't match with the text. It would be absolutely ludicrous when you consider all the evidence that the Bible speaks about Pharaoh's army sinking in the depths of the sea as stones. Doesn't seem to match up with simply a shallow marsh. And so not a likely candidate. The northern Suez area is also equally not a very good candidate, primarily because it doesn't have any of the items that are mentioned there in chapter 14. It's not at the mouth of a channel, it's at the end of a channel. There is no perspective that would cause someone to say Baal-zephon, the God of the unknown, as they would be sailing south. So it just doesn't match. The Nuweiba site is interesting in that when you travel to this portion of the Gulf of Aqaba, the children of Israel would have, if they took this route, would have come to a place where there is a large sandy beach that abruptly ends a journey across the Sinai Peninsula. And what is unique about this particular area is a fellow by the name of Ron Wyatt discovered that not only was this a good, likely place for the Exodus to take place, but he discovered in looking at this very deep Gulf of Suez that there was an underwater land bridge. Rather than it being 2,000 to 4,000 feet deep, there was a bridge of land linking the Sinai Peninsula with the land of Midian, and it was only about 200 to 300 feet below the surface. He did some archaeological exploration around the area, and discovered a number of very interesting items. One was a large pillar which had no inscription on it, but when he traveled to the other side, to the Saudi Arabian side of the land bridge, there was also a pillar, quite large, that was there, and it had Talmudic writing. It mentioned Solomon, Moses, and there was some writings on this post which seemed to indicate that these were markers for the crossing of the Red Sea. Ron Wyatt also said that he discovered buried in the coral some artifacts that, when closely examined, looked like chariot wheels and parts of chariots there embedded in the coral along this land bridge. And so during the late 1980s, when this information was first being revealed, there was a lot of skepticism, but it was the first bit of real evidence that showed that there had been something that took place on this eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula. When we look at the fourth location, the Straits of Tiran, one can immediately see that the western shore of the Sinai Peninsula is a large sandy wilderness, easily traversed from north to south. And that when you come to the end of that peninsula, you would be then forced to turn, which is what the Scripture tells us in chapter 14 of Exodus. Turn. But you will notice that as they turned, they would have immediately run into really what would look like a box canyon. So as we look at that area, we also find some interesting things. This particular area very nicely matches the description that we read in chapter 14. Number one is they turned from the wilderness of the Red Sea. They were before the mouth of the channel. They were between Migdol and the sea. In other words, the mountains were on one side of them, the sea was on the other. And it is opposite Baal Zephon, or the God of the unknown. And when you examine this particular area, there is a large island between the Sinai Peninsula and the Saudi Arabian mainland, and on that island is a very tall mountain which can be seen by sailors as a guidance point so that they are able to navigate through the narrow straits of the Straits of Tiran. But also in this area, this particular area has also an underwater land bridge. This land bridge is so close to the surface that coral reefs have grown up from this area of what we know today as Sharm el-Sheikh. It's a favorite location for divers, and there is a series of reefs that are on top of this land bridge. And this land bridge is approximately 11 miles long. When you look at a more detailed graph of those coral reefs, you'll see that that just below the surface, less than 100 feet below the surface, is this land bridge which links the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula and the land of Midian. When we read in chapter 15, verse 8, we read, "With the blast of your nostrils the waters were gathered together, the flood stood upright like a heap, the depths congealed in the heart of the sea." You see, that's describing a massive amount of water that is being held back in a miraculous way. It's certainly the description given here in Exodus 15 and elsewhere are describing the fact that this land that they were crossing over was land which was dry, and the water heaped it